Thank you very much, Peter, and it's a privilege to be here again in the State Library with this Policy Pitch series. The first thing I have to do tonight, apart from welcoming you as well, is to welcome Virginia Trioli. Virginia has many attributes. One is that she's a graduate in visual arts, and of course one could think of no higher qualification. She is a distinguished journalist. She is the vivacious host of ABC News Breakfast at an hour that many of us couldn't possibly contemplate doing anything that vigorous, but Virginia nevertheless always manages to make it seem incredibly exciting, and as a result of that is across an enormous variety of topics and is someone who is always guaranteed to ask any number of penetrating questions on them. And so when we were looking at the Orange book, which we'll talk about in a moment, which we are publishing indeed tonight, we couldn't think of anyone who would be able to be across such a broad variety of topics except Virginia. Please join me in welcoming her.
Well, with that rev up and given the hour, I just want to go home, really. Delighted you could all be here. I'm always really quite overwhelmed at the number of people and the great engagement that we see here at the Grattan Institute's policy pitches. I've been involved in one before. Similarly great crowd. I'm looking forward to some great questions from you. This event this evening is being recorded for Big Ideas, which will be broadcast on Radio National, on RN as it's known now. So stay engaged and pitch your questions accordingly, and I'll allow plenty of room for you at the end of our discussion to do that. But we have a terrific panel to hear from tonight, including John Daly himself, and to discuss the Orange book, because clearly the Grattan Institute has totally given up on any policy being discussed during the election campaign, so they're now pitching their focus for after the election campaign and to when we have the next government. I, like you, come to you as a halfway point survivor of this unbelievably dreary federal election. I can't remember one in my memory that it seems to be so devoid of fire and brimstone. At least we can perhaps bring some passion to it this evening. John Daly, of course you know. Marion Terrell is here with us and we'll be speaking about cities and transport. Tony Wood is going to be speaking, of course, about energy. The revered Stephen Duckett, who knows everything about health, will be addressing health this evening. And Andrew Norton will be speaking about higher education and answering your questions on those, and I'll give them a more formal introduction in just a moment. But let's start with John Daly, and let's start with the Orange Book. The Orange Book 2016, this publication from Grattan is being called Priorities for the Next Commonwealth Government. John, why have you written it, and why is it orange?
So one of the things that bureaucracies do during an election campaign, they don't just kind of disappear off on a holiday because there's no politicians to talk to. They typically prepare what are known as the blue and red books for incoming governments. Each department does one, and these books are presented to whichever government wins. If the Liberal National Party win, they get the blue book and the red book gets pulped. If the ALP wins, then they get the red book and the blue book gets pulped. And those books essentially look at both, here are all of the things that we have heard during the campaign that you wish to have as your platform as the new government, and here are our views as to how they might be implemented. Occasionally they go to, here is why this is going to be a tremendously difficult and indeed courageous idea to implement, Minister. And here's all the reasons why it will be terribly courageous. And of course, they are also an opportunity for the department to step back a little and talk about strategically what are the priorities. And so that's what we've done as this Orange Book, is step back and say, what do we think the priorities for the next Commonwealth Government should be? Orange, because of course that's the colour of Grattan and not the colour of any of our political parties, apart from presumably Cathy McGowan and Indi is very famously extremely orange. But with that exception, not the colour of a political party in Australia. And we're hoping to talk about the priorities for government, and indeed you will be able to download a copy of this publication from our website sometime later this evening.
So what are the priorities as you see them, or as Grattan sees them?
Well, the first thing that we do is lay out a framework for thinking about it. What is it that government's trying to do? Well, firstly, it's trying to promote economic growth. That's relatively straightforward. Secondly, governments are trying to provide a number of services, or at least support a number of services that citizens value one way or another, whether that's transport or education or health or whatever it might be. And then thirdly, governments, one way or another, are usually trying to promote fairness. Now, of course, fairness is somewhat in the eye of the beholder. How much fairness you should promote is very much in the eye of the beholder. Do you care about evening out incomes overall? Do you care about particularly looking after people at the bottom? Do you care about fairness between generations? Do you care about procedural fairness? But one way or another, you care about fairness. And then, of course, you have to deal with the fact that these things don't always line up nicely. If you, for example, provide more in the way of government services, if you redistribute more, then other things being equal, you will tend to have slower economic growth. Larger government, all other things being equal, means that we tend to have a slower growing economy, but on the other hand, we provide a whole series of services. And indeed, if you look at the trade-off that Australian governments have made over about the last 10 years, what they've essentially done is increase the size of health faster than the economy. In essence, that has increased the size of government. On the other hand, that's led, at least in part, to Australians leading longer and healthier lives. That's at heart the trade-off that we've made. And of course, the trade-off that we need to make for the future is one that we need to think through. So that's the kind of framework that we would put over this. We're trying to promote economic growth, provide services, promote fairness, and at the same time deal with the trade-offs that all of that involves.
The basic problems that Australia faces at the moment, though, really are shared globally in terms of incredibly slow growth, the cost and the size of government, the population change, climate change and the like. How do you, in this report, what priorities do you put on the key problems that Australia faces right now?
So I guess we tend to apply the same kind of lens that we put over all of Grattan's programs, which is to ask, firstly, is it big? Does it affect a lot of people? Does it have a big effect on the people that it one way or another it touches? And secondly, we look for things where we're not making as much progress as we should be. Good policy work gets done, but nothing much happens. Usually that means that's happening because there's a vested interest group. And one of the things that I think we've discovered over 7 years at Grattan is that vested interests tend to know that they've got vested interests and be very well represented. Ironically, the public interest often has relatively few friends. And the only friends it's got ultimately tend to be government and institutions like Grattan. And then thirdly, we look for things where the kind of analysis that we do, the kind of ability to look at a problem and say, well, what do the numbers say? What does the evidence say? Those are the kind of things that we've used as priorities for the Orange Book, but they also tend to be priorities for government. Where are the things that will make a really big difference? Where is it that we've actually got reasonable evidence that we know what we should do? And what is it, therefore, that we need to get on with?
And thus, we have the subject areas that are represented here this evening. So, Marion Terrell, can I move to you? And Marion is Grattan's Transport Program Director. She's a leading policy analyst and former public servant who helped write the 2010 Henry Tax Review. Not implemented, long lamented, gathering dust in a drawer somewhere, more's the pity, and has also worked for the Business Council of Australia. Marion joined the Grattan Institute in April 2015. Marion, economic activity and high-paying jobs are concentrating, of course, in the centres of our largest cities, but of course more and more people have to live in the suburbs, far from the centres, and still they mostly travel into the centres, and we see the problems as we saw this morning on the southeastern and the Monash. How should a Commonwealth Government respond to that when we apparently have this new focus now on reinvigorating cities?
So it's true, we all of a sudden are hearing so much about cities, and particularly about the Commonwealth's role in cities. So big cities are really important. They're where most GDP is generated and most GDP growth is. They're also where most population already lives and most new population chooses to live. Most jobs are within 5, so a quarter of all jobs are within 5 kilometres of CBDs and 40% within 10 kilometres. And these trends are set to continue. It's a good thing for us in a lot of ways for cities to be bigger. provided that they work as cities rather than as a series of disconnected villages. There's an emerging understanding internationally that as a city doubles in size, it more than doubles in GDP per capita, wages per capita, innovation per capita. So then the role for the Commonwealth, I think, in light of that, is to make sure, to the extent of its capacity in this area, that cities work as well as they can. So the things that I think could happen for the Commonwealth are, the Commonwealth spends about $8 billion a year on transport infrastructure, and a lot of that is spent in what I think is quite a wasteful way in the country on infrastructure that's not used by many people and is not that economically important. Instead,
but might be politically important.
It might be politically important. Improving the functioning of cities and people's capacity to get around in the big cities would be one thing that the Commonwealth could do that would really make a difference.
And can I just ask you a question before we move on about political reality in that respect? Because, of course, it's the states and even sometimes the local councils that actually get a little bit more control of this. How feasible is it that any government that has the cities in its focus can actually parachute in and make policy change, make effective policy change?
You're quite right that it's the state and the local governments that have got the primary governing role of cities. But cities are important not just to the local area and to the state, but they are important to the national economy. I think typically and historically the way the Commonwealth does get the states to do things is it gives them financial inducements. And it could do that in this situation. So it could give the states financial inducements to replace stamp duty with a broad-based land tax, for example, and it could give them inducements, I suppose, to consider other things like relaxing land use planning so that more people can live closer to the city centre and in the inner and middle rings rather than being forced to the outer rings while we have such incredibly low density of cities in this country.
I know that's going to get some commentary as we move along because it's a policy that's attractive to many, except when you hit those middle rings, and then you get the pushback. Let me introduce Tony Wood formally. Before joining Grattan in 2011, Tony worked in senior roles at Origin Energy for 14 years. He was also Program Director of Clean Energy Projects at the Clinton Foundation, and in 2008 was seconded to offer an industry perspective to the first Garno climate change review. So he's skilled in both areas, if I can pitch them against each other, energy and climate change mitigation. Climate change policy is a bit of a mess, though, at the moment, Tony. So where do the two parties stand at the moment on the issue? And are there any grounds for optimism at the moment that Australia might actually, in some meaningful way, move to really reduce our carbon emissions?
Well, I guess you are correct. If you look at the landscape of
nice and close for that, mate.
The landscape of the climate policy over the last 7 or 8 years in Australia, it's littered with the dead bodies of both leaders of oppositions, leaders of parties, and prime ministers. So it's certainly been one of the more toxic areas of policy debate that we've had in the last in that period of time. And when you talk to people outside this country, Australia is now being held up as an example how not to do it, because we are, I think, the first country that actually got rid of a carbon tax or carbon price. So there's not exactly the record we should be looking for. However, when you look at the current election campaign, one of the things that I think is actually for the first time giving me some grounds for optimism is that it's not a big issue in the election campaign. And the reason I say that is because maybe we could get some bipartisan support rather than being pushed to the corners, as often happens when governments are discussing something which is as toxic and as difficult as climate change policy. So maybe there's an opportunity here for some common ground. And even though when you look at the positions of the parties, they have different targets for 2030, they have some differences around what they would do in some detail, but they have both agreed to a target, and they've both agreed to using market mechanisms to get there. And we think that maybe keeping this off the agenda for the election could be the beginnings of working out how to move forward, because just throwing it out and starting again is a very bad look.
And moving to those polarised positions, as you say, it removes the whole argument as well. It means you actually don't end up getting any policy development.
Exactly, yeah, and other countries have seen exactly the same problem.
So on that point that you make about, there being agreement about some sort of market mechanism, and in the spirit of what you're saying, do you also further suggest that as long as the phrase carbon pricing is not used either, then you might actually end up with some bipartisan support or even tripartisan?
Well, it's unfortunate in a sense, but I guess it's the nature of politics that language becomes important. And so, we had a time in this country where we couldn't use the words energy and climate change in the same sentence. And so in some places in Australia, you had to use climate variability rather than climate change as the way you describe this phenomenon. And so we've ended up with a very unusual debate around language. And the very fact that you can have as many different forms of emissions trading as there probably are almost people in this room tonight, Virginia, just reminds me how we've got to try and get away from that. So I don't really care, in a sense, if they don't design the perfect economically efficient emissions trading scheme. For God's sake, let's have something that we start to work with and starts us moving in the right direction rather than arguing about what particular form of carbon policy we're going to use, because that's what we've done, and that's got us where we are today, which is almost nowhere.
Before we move on, just one other question to you about power prices, which really have gone up vastly, quite significantly, by more than 60% in the last few years. Why is that happening, and is there anything the government can actually do about that?
It does touch a little bit, Virginia, on the point about state and federal politics, because we do have a situation, particularly in some states, where governments are conflicted because they still own the assets and have used those assets as a way of raising more money for treasuries in the past. And that has created some of the problems we've had, because it's been the costs of the networks, that is the cost of the networks that deliver the electricity from the centralised generators to our homes and businesses, that has been the biggest contributor to high costs in the last 7 or 8 years. And it's been a big contributor. So what that means is that governments need to do 2 or 3 things. One is the incoming government needs to seriously push the states that haven't privatised to privatise. You can have a long intellectual conversation about it, but the reality is that where they have been privatised, they're cheaper. And they're just as efficient and just as reliable and just as safe as when they're in government hands. The second thing is we need to basically change the way we price the electricity, or the networks in particular, because what the industry has been doing on our behalf, encouraged by governments, is to build the system to meet peak demand, which only occurs a couple of times a year, and yet they've been building it bigger and bigger. It's like building the MCG big enough to cater for everybody who wants to turn up on grand final day. That would clearly be patently absurd, and yet that's what we have done with networks. And if we price them differently, people would have an incentive to think about the way we use these systems more efficiently, bring down the prices for everybody. And if governments were prepared to take that on, it would make a big difference. The reason they haven't, as with a lot of other policy areas, those sort of changes create winners and losers. And even if the losers are in the minority, they tend to have the loudest voices.
Tony, thank you. Stephen Duckett is next, and Stephen has held operational and policy leadership positions in healthcare in Australia and Canada, including as Secretary of what's now the Commonwealth Department of Health. An economist, he's a Fellow of the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia. So, Stephen Duckett, given your vast experience in the health policy sector in Australia, could you please solve all the problems that we have with the health system? Thank you.
Well, Virginia, the reason I think some of the problems haven't been solved is that the health system is complex, and simple, quick fixes are generally wrong. And so that's one answer. The other answer is the great healthcare identity. That is, every dollar of health spending is the dollar of some health provider's income, be they a doctor or a hospital or whatever. And surprisingly, if you're talking about trying to reduce expenditure, that also means you're trying to reduce a health provider's income. And they're not always very happy about that. And so what the technical term is snouts in the trough, or rent seekers, or whatever. But at Grattan...
Very complex terms.
At Grattan, for example, we've done work on pharmaceutical pricing, which has shown that Australia pays pharmaceutical industry chemists way too much money relative to other countries. We've done work on pathology pricing. Again, we pay the two big pathology companies, in fact all pathology services, way more than we need to pay. So there's money to be saved in the health industry, but there's also money that needs to be spent in the health industry. So, for example, we're not providing appropriate end-of-life care. We need to be providing greater investments in that area. We need to be restructuring the way we fund general practice to deal better with chronic conditions. Australians pay way more out of pocket than any other comparable country, so we need to be addressing out-of-pockets and transparency of charging and so on. So there's lots of things that need to be done, but it's not one quick, simple fix.
If you could offer some advice to the next incoming government to focus on a couple of key areas. You mentioned there pharmaceutical pricing and pathology being two. What else would you add to that?
There's money to be saved in improving hospital efficiency. There's huge variation.
Can I just jump in there? What do you mean by hospital efficiency?
So, for example, if you compare the costs of a hip replacement across different hospitals, there's a 50 or something % difference within Victoria, for example, in the cost of a hip replacement, and the bigger difference between Victorian hospitals and hospitals in New South Wales or Queensland, or in fact, to take the extreme, the ACT. So there's huge variations in costs which are not associated, as far as we can tell, with variations in outcomes. So we ought to be putting further pressure on the hospitals to say, look, there are still waiting lists, especially waiting lists for outpatient services. You need to be providing more services, but we're not going to give you any money for it, so you have to find some efficiencies to actually provide those services.
Okay. I'm sure there'll be plenty of more questions that dig down into just the quick observations that Stephen's made there. But I'll introduce to you now Andrew Norton, who's speaking tonight on higher education. He's worked as a policy advisor to the University of Melbourne Vice-Chancellor. In the late 90s, he was an advisor to the then Federal Education Minister, Dr. David Kemp. And with Dr. Kemp, he conducted a federal government review of the higher education funding system. Their report, you might remember, was published in 2014. Andrew, the size and the costs of higher education system are rising. Should the government put a cap on student numbers or allow the system to just keep growing?
Well, what's happened is that the federal government in 2012 removed the previous controls on undergraduate student numbers. And as a result, we've seen a huge escalation. There's been about a 40% increase in student numbers over 5 or 6 years. And so that's caused a big increase in direct subsidies to universities, and it's caused a big increase in total student debt and problems in the health student loan scheme. Even though there are very clear problems with this, the review that was just mentioned oppose recapping the system. And there are various reasons for that. One is that the system we've now got is extremely flexible in meeting skills demands. And we've done a much better job, for example, of maybe causing too many health professionals, but we've dealt with lots of skill shortages in the health industry. And when industries go down, the numbers go down as well, because the previous system lacked all that flexibility. It's also meant that universities are now competing for students rather than being guaranteed their student numbers. And I think we're all hoping that that leads to improvements in the student experience at university, which we can see in student satisfaction.
And what are the policy consequences of a large and growing system, do you think?
Well, the policy consequence has really been that governments are casting around for ways to save money in higher education. And to date, probably they haven't come up with very good ways. So very crude things like just a flat percentage cut across the board, rather than looking at, how much should we be spending given what we expect from the system. So I think we really need a sort of root and branch review of how we do it, rather than ad hoc, panicked budget measures.
Okay, and we'll get to perhaps some more of details of them, the questions. John, I'm going to come to you now because you're the budget guru here this evening. The state of Australia's budget, generally speaking, can we say, notwithstanding the deficit, and we all hear endlessly about that we are in decent shape compared to other countries?
Well, I think the Australian economy or the Australian government budget is a little bit like somebody who is overweight and not exercising and eating too much cheese. So we have a situation in which, yes, the Australian government debt is smaller than the debt of many other countries, and that's because we've made very wise decisions in the past. But we're not making particularly wise decisions today. And despite the fact that we've just had the largest mining boom in Australia's history, and quite probably the largest mining boom in history anywhere in the world, nevertheless, we have a budget which is in significant deficit and has been running deficits of around about $40 billion a year every year for the last 8 years. Now, the consequences of that are twofold. The first is it's very unfair to younger generations. When you run a deficit to fund recurrent expenses, and that's what we've been doing. It's not that this deficit is funding a huge increase in how much governments spend on either education or transport infrastructure. Most of it has gone to essentially funding quite big increases in health spending, material increases in age pensions over and above economic growth, and indeed reductions in taxes for some groups of people, particularly those over the age of 65. So that's where we've spent the money, and we're essentially saying every time we run a deficit of $40 billion that to younger generations, households under the age of 35, congratulations, you are going to pay additional tax at some stage over your life of about $10,000 to pay back that $40 billion deficit we've incurred this year. And given that we've now been doing it 8 years in a row, that's about an $80,000 debt that at some stage those households are going to pay in additional taxes. So that's one reason for being worried about these kind of deficits. The other reason is that if you look at what happened through the global financial crisis, Australia got away with it. Most other countries saw big drops in their economic output. Indeed, many of them still have economic output today lower than where they were in 2008. We also saw in many of those countries big jumps in unemployment. And we also saw many of them make very, very unpleasant decisions, which by and large hit those people at the bottom hardest, and that was because they just didn't have any other choices. Because Australia had very little accumulated debt, indeed at that stage it actually had negative net debt, which is a complicated way of saying the Australian government had money in the bank. And because we in 2008 had substantial budget surpluses, we could afford to do very, very substantial stimulus of the economy from government. And that meant we didn't see a big jump in unemployment. We didn't see a big reduction in Australian economic activity, and we got away with it. Now, if we hit a substantial financial crisis today, we're in much worse shape. We're already running a very big deficit. We now have much more debt than we used to, and so our flexibility in that kind of crisis is much lower than it used to be. And so that's why these ongoing budget deficits are a significant concern.
And do you see that either of the two main parties are seriously committed to budget repair?
Well, I think we've got ourselves into a couple of pathologies, sort of bad ways of thinking and bad ways of behaving. So the official line is that they all care about the budget deficit. But this is something where it's really important not to watch their mouths, but instead to watch what they actually do. And there's a couple of things we can watch them actually doing.
Are you about to tell us about psychological tells or something else?
Well, they are a little bit like psychological tells. So the first thing they do is that they start talking about the long term. Don't you worry about the budget deficit today. Over the next 10 years, everything will be fine. Now, of course, what that amounts to is a promise that the next government is going to do more than this government. And if this government isn't prepared to make any tough decisions, why would you believe that the next government is going to make tough decisions? And indeed, we've got a number of the rating agencies effectively saying exactly that. They're nervous about what they call the political will to make decisions. In other words, they don't see anyone doing the tough decisions in the short run. So that's one problem, it's the long-termism. The other problem that we see is, if you like, short-termism. They say, look, we're just pretty confident that everything is going to get a lot better. It's essentially an optimism bias. Look, we've got these projections. They show that everything floats back to surplus within 4 years. Don't you worry about that budget deficit thing. The problem is, though, that those optimistic assumptions have been made now for 7 years in a row, and so far it hasn't turned out so well. So we've got this optimism bias, and because they assume that everything's going to float back to surplus, they say, well, that means we're justified not making the tough decisions today.
But as I understand the Orange Book, the proposal by the Grattan Institute is probably the least politically popular one you could make, which is to decrease spending and increase taxes.
Yeah, and of course, there is no other way to solve a budget deficit. There are only two parts to a budget: spending and revenue. And if you have,
you put it so baldly that at this point, any policymakers or any members of the government or the opposition have turned off the radio and aren't listening.
That's absolutely right. But I think one of the issues here is that the public are up for this. You look at most of the surveys that have been run, and concern about the budget deficit almost invariably pops up as being towards the top of people's concerns. Why is nothing happening? As you say, because either increasing taxes or reducing spending is rarely popular. But I think one of the other things that's happened is that Australia's got itself into this sort of American pathology of saying, one side of politics says, well, we're going to fix the budget by increasing taxes, but we can't possibly touch spending. And then we have the other side of politics saying, look, we really need to get the spending down because any increase in tax will be bad. Now, that's the official ideology. Ironically, when you look at what they actually do, both of them plan to fix the budget by doing both, because when you run a $40 billion budget deficit, you're not going to close that gap without doing both. But the rhetoric is divorced from the reality, and consequently it's tough to prosecute the argument in public.
Yes, jump in.
That's a common issue across all of the things that we're dealing with tonight, and that is that I think our political leaders have undersold the preparedness of our communities, given the right information, to understand the choices that the governments have to make. If they're properly explained, they can bring the community with us. But I think there's been this move to say, well, we're not going to do any of that. We're going to magically make it happen differently by, as John said, clearly either spending the money or not fixing it, but pretending otherwise. And that's where I think there needs to be a greater engagement about the choices that we have in any area of policy that can be better communicated to people to help understand those choices.
Stephen, do you want to pick up there? Is there that particular observation as it intersects with your area of expertise in health?
So there's two sides to that. Yes, there's money to be saved in the health sector. There's efficiencies to be made. And secondly, we know historically that the public have accepted increases in the Medicare levy to pay for expansions of health services, to pay for a guns buyback, to pay for other initiatives. So even in the health sector, you can see there's savings to be made, cuts on the spending side, and also people are prepared to pay for the increased taxes.
Marion, can I ask you about the issue of the untapped wealth that might be in cities, which Malcolm Turnbull spoke about when he first got the top job and appointed a minister for cities. Tell us a little bit about what that might be, what that might look at, and how a new federal government might tap into that.
So the capacity, cities are a little bit different to what John's describing, in that a lot of what the Commonwealth would do in relation to cities is more in the nature of investment than in recurrent spending. And particularly when you think about things like the Commonwealth's role in investing in transport infrastructure, that really, if that is done effectively, it should increase the productive capacity of cities. So it should increase the ability of people to get around, and it's really important for economic growth that happens. So the way that happens is each person in the big cities has got access to a bigger pool of potential jobs, and so they're much more likely to find a job that uses their skills and abilities. And similarly, employers have got a bigger talent pool to draw on, and so they can get the best person for their job. So you get people doing a better job at work, and employers being able to get the right people. But that's contingent on you being able to get from A to B rather than to choose a job that's just in your suburb. So that's where there really is potential in cities, and where the Commonwealth could have a role. So I know the current government is looking at this idea of city deals, and that is a little bit different. So that is really an idea where different levels of government get together and on a geographic basis set their own priorities, which will be different in Sydney to Melbourne, and pool their resources and their decision making. So although there is a lot of talk about that, I think we are yet to see anything that looks anything like that.
Andrew, can I just ask you, in your area of education, following the failure of the government to get through their higher university reforms, can you tell us about what the universities most want, if we can speak about them as one group, which maybe we can't, and maybe you can explain that a little more as well? And is it antithetical to what we as a community might want from our higher education sector? Do the two ambitions meet?
I think they all want more money, and they have been very persistent in arguing for that over many, many decades. Largely unsuccessfully, I would note that even though aggregate spending has gone up a lot, per student spending has not. So one of the big issues we've got here is the way we've organised higher education is that universities all do both teaching and research, but that's quite an expensive way of running a university. And one of the big issues in the whole fee deregulation debate back in 2014 and 2015 was, if we deregulated fees, what would happen to the money? And a paper we did last year, I think, persuaded us that at least for the current deregulated markets for international students, a lot of that is simply spent on research. And so one of the big issues is, if we do increase per student funding, how do we make sure that students actually directly benefit from that?
Tony, I also wanted to ask you, given the rhetoric around innovation, and I don't use that word dismissively, but I mean, we are hearing conversations now based on the idea that we genuinely need to innovate. Where does the energy sector come in there? And is there actually a decent economic argument for serious investment in renewable technologies here in this country? Could that turn into something very valuable for Australia?
Well, I think the energy sector globally is one of the big underspenders in terms of research and development, in technology or in innovation. And I separate the two because a lot of innovation that occurs in a whole range of sectors isn't about the invention. It's about taking what someone else has invented and actually making it work really cheaply. And that's much more interesting.
Can you give us an example of that?
Well, for example, with the most obvious one in recent times would be solar panels. I mean, some of the best technology was developed in Australia, or in some parts of the US. Wasn't that many years ago that other companies in those countries were actually leading. Guess who made the big impact in terms of driving down the cost of solar panels? It was the Chinese. Now, they've taken the technology a lot further, basically manufactured at scale and driven it down. So there are some opportunities here. The biggest issue that I now can see around moving away from high-emitting technologies such as we have today, particularly in places like Australia and Victoria, towards a situation where we have different mixes of technologies, isn't so much about whether we can have more wind farms or solar panels. It's how on earth we integrate them into the system we have today, namely all these transmission lines and wires and poles that go throughout our streets, because that system wasn't designed for distributed generation. And what we're seeing in various parts of the world is, how the hell do we do that? And big investment being needed there. And I think the innovation for Australia is more likely to be in a country like ours, which is a bit unusual. We're not like Germany. We're connected to a whole lot of other countries. Yeah. We have several small countries connected to each other by very thin wires that sometimes fail, as Tasmania found out until today. Our innovation could be around how we do that, because that would be a significant change.
Plays into innovation much more generally. As you say, we've heard a lot about it. Any theory will tell you that ultimately your economic growth depends on your innovation. But I think there are two things that are worth bearing in mind as you set Commonwealth priorities around innovation. The first is, the innovation we care about is not necessarily invention. If innovations are come up with anywhere in the world and applied in Australia, we all wind up benefiting. And indeed, if Australia pulls its weight in invention, about 98% of the improvements to our lives will in fact be invented elsewhere in the world. But whether our lives improve depend on whether or not we implement them here. And those things can often be very prosaic. Tony's talked about the kind of fancy technology on the cells and exactly what chemicals and all the rest of it you're putting onto your solar panels. But actually a large part of the cost is now, how do you attach the thing to your roof? It's not very glamorous. But, figuring out, look, I can attach it to your roof with, one fewer pieces of metal can make a difference in the long run. And that's something that we can quite possibly copy from some German roof builder and apply here very happily and save ourselves a lot of money in the process. But that, of course, happens across the economy. So there's this distinction between invention and innovation. You need to bear in mind that 98% of the innovation we care about is not necessarily invented here. The second thing you need to bear in mind in terms of innovation policy is that the thing that really focuses people's mind on innovation is not government promising to give you a little bit of cash for going and innovating. If you look at the history of innovation funds and policies across the world, it would be fair to say that very few of them have had a particularly large impact. The thing that really gets companies to innovate is competition and knowing that their back is to the wall and that if they don't do things differently to tomorrow, they won't change and they won't survive. If companies are kind of fat, lazy, happy and profitable because they're not having to compete very hard, often they don't innovate very much. It's when their back is to the wall they all of a sudden start innovating, and that's why competition policy matters so much. Now, we've done a lot of the broad competition policy reforms. Many of the policy reforms that are now needed are very much focused on particular industries because governments put all of these rules and regulations around every single industry. Often those rules and regulations are ultimately designed to benefit the people who are already working in that industry because they effectively stop other people from competing with them. And so one of the biggest things that a Commonwealth Government can do is methodically work through a series of industries and ask, how can we make it more efficient? And that's, I guess, the work, for example, we've done in the superannuation industry. It's very large. It's more than 1% of Australian GDP. It appears to be pretty inefficient. It's got some people who essentially charge you way more than others to manage your superannuation and do no better job, indeed probably do a worse job. And that is partly because of the way the industry is structured and set up. And there are things that governments could do, Commonwealth in particular, that would encourage the players in that particular industry to in fact compete with each other much harder. We've got lots of competitors in that industry, but they don't in fact compete very much.
I've got a couple of questions here already pre-submitted by audience members, so thank you, which I want to ask of the panel now. While I'm doing that, we have some roving microphones, I think, in the room. Can I see where they are? We have two people with mics, so we have one on this side and one just here. And if you've got a question, can I see hands in the air? I'll try and identify you now. And we'll line that up. So we have a first question here, if we can get a mic there, and I'll come to you in a moment. And our next question will be, don't be shy, you're not going to have these people sitting in front of you for too much longer. Second question will be there, but I get to go first. So this is a really good question, and it goes to all of you. But Stephen, I want to start with you. How is the increasing digitisation, Internet of Things, which is such a great phrase, going to change your particular area, your area of health? Where do you see the great change and development, pressure, opportunity, threat, I guess, from digitisation?
So in the health sector, the whole digitisation and so on has been a huge waste of money. It's one of the best ways for governments to waste their money is the electronic health record, and all of that. There's been some stupid pathways we've gone down.
So can I just jump? The electronic health record and the idea of that and the investment in that has been a total waste of money, you believe?
The national personally controlled electronic health record so far has been a complete waste of money in my view. That's not to say that I'm still not a supporter of an electronic health record. Properly implemented, there is evidence that that this can lead to better care and so on, and a more efficient provision of services. But it's got to be done on a rigorous business case. It's got to be done very carefully. I'll tell you an example. When I was chair of the board of the Alfred, we digitised the radiology service there. The management brought the business case to the board, I think 3 times before the board accepted it, because each time there were aspirations. Oh, we're going to save all this money here, or we're going to improve quality there, without actually nailing down how you would actually do it. And so we forced the management to come back 3 times until they were actually able to demonstrate it. And it was able to be demonstrated. The Alfred was the first hospital in Victoria to have a digitised radiology service. And it worked, and it was good. But it had the potential not to work and not be good.
So as long as the ideas are rigorously interrogated, then clearly there are advantages and savings to be made too.
Yes.
Okay. Andrew, what's your response to that question about digitisation, opportunities, savings and money wastage?
I'm more optimistic than Stephen on this. And one of the really interesting things we've seen over time is that even though student-staff ratios have got worse, student satisfaction with feedback and communication with academics has gone up a lot. And I think there's a very simple reason for that is electronic communication is much more effective than the old system of queuing outside the academic store for 2 hours per week.
I was going to say waiting in the corridor. I remember doing that.
Exactly.
You mean they actually answer emails now, do they?
Actually answer emails, or there are learning management systems where students all ask the same questions, so it's all up there once rather than everyone doing it separately. Now I think we're moving to the stage where we can use data about what students are doing much more effectively. Partly this is universities working out who's engaged and who's not, and acting on those who are not engaged. But there's something called adaptive learning software, where the software actually adapts to where the student is academically. And so if they've missed a concept, it just keeps going back to it, explaining it different ways until they learn it. And that's really important in subjects where if you miss something at the start, you're confused for the rest.
Marion?
So digitisation is really important in transport and really promising. So there's a real urge to build more infrastructure all the time, more new roads, more new railway. But in fact, what the use of data can do for us is to help us to manage the peak times, which is really what a lot of the building is for. So, for example, it can give people in peak hour traffic signals before they head out about where the peaks are going to be, and they can choose to avoid them if they're free to do that, or else they can go out knowing what they're in for, maybe arrange to do something a bit later on, or whatever it might be. But information is fantastic for using using what we already have more efficiently. I think it also does open up opportunities that have been a little bit hard to imagine in the past. One example would be road pricing. So because we carry sensors around with us, and because there are a lot more fixed sensors in the world, there's the ability to know where a particular vehicle is. So the whole business of road pricing becomes more sort of technologically feasible at a reasonable kind of cost and with a reasonable degree of sophistication.
Well, I've got you. Can I get you to reflect on something that I heard recently at an infrastructure conference, and it was so interesting. A woman there on the panel brought to us the case study of a company she was working with that gave all the employees iPads, gave them all, fantastic connections and the like, organised their work groups differently, organised their weekly outcomes differently, and said, work wherever and however you like. And in one fell swoop, that took 35 cars off the road. They weren't driving in from the outer suburbs and into the city location anymore. They were working effectively, and it had to be reviewed from time to time to make sure that the system was there. But that example of digitisation and the way it affects both cities and roads and transport, to me, was very interesting. Is that a realistic case study to you?
Well, yes and no.
Start with the yes.
So it's great to be freer and to be able to do things at different times and places. I think that freedom can be fantastic, and it can allow people to manage other parts of their lives better. But the no part is that we are social creatures, and the whole benefits, the reason why people want to be in big cities and why they locate in big cities, and a lot of the productivity benefits that come from that are actually to do with human interaction.
So the water cooler will always win. Tony?
There's actually, in this area, a strong interaction with transport, because the evolution of electric vehicles and the way in which they can be used both as a source of transport but also as a source of backup power will be important because they'll be able to be connected. But if you live in the state of Victoria, and if you're not one of those people who thought that a smart meter was going to fry your brain, you probably have a smart meter in your house to measure your electricity. Unfortunately, having spent $2 or $3 billion on these things several years ago now, because government's actually implemented it very badly, we haven't used the information much on those meters. Yes, we don't have to read the meter anymore, and we can disconnect and reconnect electronically, remotely, but we're not using the information. I think the potential to use that information in similar ways to what Marion was saying, where by using that information and interacting with smart appliances, so for example, if someone said to you, look, we're going to save you $1,000 a year from your electricity bill, and it'll all be done automatically, and you won't notice any difference in your comfort, because what will actually happen technically is on those hot days, your air conditioner will be turned off for about 10 minutes in an hour, and your neighbour's the next 10 minutes, and your next neighbour's the next 10 minutes. You don't notice the difference, but the entire suburb's electricity demand at peak time goes down. So the potential to use that information much more powerfully is dramatic. Enormous amounts of data involved because you're reading these things every home, every 5 minutes, and you can imagine what the data involved in that will be, but the potential is enormous, and the costs of doing so are within reach. So there's some really exciting potential there to make a big difference to those costs you mentioned before.
Sounds like a terrible invasion of my privacy, Tony. He's not concerned at all. He's not concerned at all about it.
Interestingly, what happened a few years ago, Premier Mike Grattan decided to do exactly what I was just talking about and got exactly that feedback from the community, and they didn't go ahead.
Of course.
And yet, more recently, other places, when people have better explained what this is about and what would happen in Queensland, it's going very well. So it's not necessarily just about the technology. It's often about how you communicate to people to understand what they're going to get.
We have our first question from the audience. Good evening.
Hey, this is a quick question for Stephen.
Nice and high, that microphone.
We've had a pharmaceutical and pathology reviews, but we haven't reviewed the cost per procedure, so the charge against the billing codes of the doctor's time. Like technology and other advances have allowed some efficiency gains. For example, in ophthalmology, procedures now take significantly less time. But have we reviewed the charging rates per time against those Medicare codes? And do you think there's any scope for cost savings if we did review those charges?
Thanks very much. So the short answer is yes, there's huge amounts of cost savings. The example you gave is a good one, that the price or the rebate that's paid for cataract procedures, for example, is way in excess of what is a reasonable return on the minutes of time involved. So the number of minutes it takes to do a cataract procedure has dropped dramatically, but the price that's paid has not, and so the income to ophthalmologists has significantly increased. Government about 5 years ago tried to address that. The ophthalmologist, remember my point about expenditure equals income, the ophthalmologist mounted a campaign using their patients to try and stop that, which they were successful in because the politics were just not were horrendous. So it is absolutely something we have to continually address to try and make sure that there's a fair income for health workers of all kinds, and that we adjust the prices to reflect changes in technology and changes in the ability to do things and so on. So yes, there's money to be saved there. And also, in some cases, the providers charge out-of-pocket costs for this, including for cataract operations. In my view, the government should actually publish what each ophthalmologist, what each surgeon, what each general practice charges, both in terms of their bulk billing rates and their out-of-pocket costs. The government already collects that information. It can do it right now, and I think it should be put into the public domain quite easily and cheaply, and should be done as soon as the government's returned, or whichever government is returned.
Thanks, Stephen. And I think we have our next question is over here. Hello.
In Australia, we have a 3-year political cycle, whereas, say, in the United Kingdom it's 5 years, and in Victoria we have a 4-year fixed term. Do you think the short political cycle in the federal sphere prevents governments from making courageous decisions?
As in the yes minister sense of courageous decisions? John Daly.
Clearly a 3-year political cycle doesn't help. And you're absolutely right to say our governments have been very reluctant to make tough decisions. We've had example after example tonight where we more or less know what reforms need to be done in the public interest, but staring down the interest groups is just too hard. On the other hand, if you look back over our history, we put through an enormous number of very politically difficult reforms through the 80s and 90s, and we still had a 3-year political cycle. So it's not impossible. I'd suggest there are probably other reasons that explain why we've really struggled over the last decade, and the shortest and most important of those is prosperity. Governments are a little bit like companies. They tend not to make so many difficult decisions if their backs are not to the wall. When you put their backs to the wall and they run out of choices, that's when they make hard calls. And because we have lived through a period of extraordinary prosperity in the mining boom, governments, particularly Commonwealth governments, had not made particularly hard calls in the last 10 years. Hopefully we are now moving into a period in which they will have to make more of those tough calls, and ironically we will all be better off in the long run if they do so. So I think it can be done. But it will require governments to stare down interest groups, and it will require them to provide very clear explanations of what they are doing and why it's in the public interest.
Sir, can you put your hand up again just so we can see? Thank you. Yes.
Hi. So will reducing company tax increase economic growth? If it won't, then what kind of tax changes would increase economic growth, and which ones would actually generate more jobs in the process?
Before we hear from John, does anyone else want to offer an observation there? Tony, do you have a view?
I think some of you may have come across a book called Capital in the 20th Century by Piketty. It's about this thick, and most people, by the vast majority of people who start it, never finish it.
I hear actually that is now the least read book ever published.
No, that's not. It's the second least finished book on Kindle. The least finished book on Kindle is apparently Hillary Clinton's memoirs.
The good news is that Piketty's written a book this thick, which is, I think it's called Chronicles of Our Time. And he makes the point that one of the big things that occurred after the Depression in the United States in relation to addressing some of the failures of the economics, the financial system at the time, not only was reining in the banks, but actually making the top marginal tax rate more than 70%. Now and economic growth...
Did you hear the silence just then?
Economic growth through that period for the next 20 or 30 or 40 years continued very strongly in the United States. So there's an interesting policy in terms of what impact tax can make in terms of economic growth. In fact, what tends to happen is I think most people go ahead with their investments most of the time without much difference in marginal tax rates.
Andrew, do you have a view on this one? Or shall we?
Not on company tax.
John.
Well, to borrow Marion's very wise answer to a previous question, I think the answer to your question is no and yes. So, will a company tax rate increase incomes in Australia in the next 10 years? The answer is almost certainly no. It will probably increase GDP, economic activity. But we don't actually care about economic activity. What we care about is the economic activity that increases our incomes. And roughly speaking, the difference is how much gets taken out of the country as profits by people who don't live here. And of course, when you cut company tax rate because of our dividend imputation scheme, has almost no impact on domestic investors. In effect, their company tax rate is not what you read as the headline rate of 30%. In effect, the company tax rate on profits made by companies is their personal tax rate because of dividend imputation. But for foreigners who own shares in companies that operate in Australia, their effective tax rate is the company tax rate. And so if we cut it, they take more money out of the country. And so national incomes actually fall. And given the timetable the government is talking about, and also how long it takes for companies to start investing more, chances are national incomes would fall for at least a decade, possibly longer. Now, in the long run, you would see national income start to rise because foreigners would have more incentives to invest in Australia, or at least that's the theory, and ultimately that would leave us better off. Now, bear in mind, not by very much. So to put it in context, what this means is that in about 25 years' time, instead of our incomes being about 48% higher than they are today, which is what we'd expect given normal economic growth, there'll be about 47%. Sorry, instead of them being 47% higher, they'll be about 48% higher. So we're not talking, as they used to say, sheep stations, although sheep stations, of course, not worth as much as they used to be. In theory, it will over time make a difference. But one, it's pretty small. And two, you've got to go through this very big and long period in which actually incomes go backwards. Now, one of the things you could do to reduce some of that, rather than just cutting company tax across the board, is to say, well, we will essentially only give the tax break to new investment, because that's why we're doing it. And so, for example, you might either have an accelerated rate of depreciation, or you might, one way or another, create lower tax rates for new investments. Now, interestingly, although that idea has now been around for a little while, indeed Craig Emerson has, I think, proposed it on no fewer than 4 occasions on the pages of the Australian Financial Review over the last few months, it has been blithely ignored by business lobby groups. And that does lead to at least a suggestion that what they would quite like is the windfall on investments they have already made, because by definition, all the things they've already invested, they were quite happy to do that at a tax rate of 30%. But of course, if the tax rate does drop to 25%, it will be a huge windfall for all of those who have invested already. So the long answer to your question is that company tax rates will ultimately improve economic growth, but there are probably some smarter ways to do it that means there'll be less of a drop in the short run. In terms of other tax changes that would really have a big impact, probably the largest of them, the one where the payoff is the largest, is to reduce stamp duties and pay for that by increasing general property taxes. Now, of course, that is, in theory at least, a state government responsibility. But as with many of these changes, it's one where Commonwealth Government incentives, as Marion calls them, bribes, as I call them, would be probably quite effective. As Paul Keating once very famously remarked, never get between state premiers and a bucket of money. If the Commonwealth promises the states money to make that kind of economic reform, there is a much higher chance that they will actually do it. So if you're looking for a tax rate change that'll make a really big difference, that's probably a good place to start.
I saw a hand up the back here. I think there was a question. Yes. Thank you.
So what then are the best ways about raising revenue? We've heard a lot about keeping costs down, but what are the lowest hanging fruit to really raise the money there?
I'd like to throw that to the other panellists in your specific areas of interest because, we talk about savings and we've been discussing growth and how growth is sluggish virtually everywhere. Do we have any suggestions, Andrew?
I do have some on the revenue side, which is to speed up repayment of student debt. At the moment, unless you earn over $54,000, you don't repay. That's meaning large numbers of people working part-time but in a high-income household aren't repaying their debt. So this is not targeting the people that the income contingent loan scheme is designed to protect, which is low-income households. And so we suggested a $42,000 threshold instead of $54,000, which would bring an extra couple of 100,000 people into repayment and actually bring a big cash boost to the Treasury.
Okay. Stephen?
The health portfolio, or of relevance to the health portfolio, of course, is the Medicare levy, which is an income tax effectively. Also, there's been some work done recently on taxing energy-dense foods, which would change behaviours and so on, which I think would be a positive move. And of course, taxing use of cars more efficiently would be another one which would also have benefits.
And the health insurance rebate, which I guess is technically increasing a tax?
So the health, it's a subsidy, of course. So reducing the health insurance rebate. When the health insurance rebate was introduced, it didn't change the behaviour of anybody. And so it basically didn't change public hospital utilisation, which was said to change. And so if you removed it, it probably wouldn't change the behaviour of anybody else either, except it would change the number of people with health insurance and save a few $billion a year, which is not to be sneezed at.
Tony?
The theoretically perfect system to address climate change is put in place a stable and rising price on carbon, which increases steadily over time. And if you did that, and most governments haven't yet been prepared to do precisely what I just said, then you would also create a source of significant revenue. Much of that revenue, rather than just being cycled back to the big emitters of carbon, would actually potentially be used to address some of the structural issues with some of the taxes we've already got, to make them much more effective and address some of those inequities. So, and that could be a very significant amount of money. Could easily be criticised by being a great big carbon tax, but if it was done properly, you might actually end up not only with addressing climate change, but also a much better tax system as well.
And now you've just polarised that debate that you said wasn't polarised these days. See what you did there? Marion.
So there's quite a lot of revenue raised in the transport area. The biggest item is fuel excise at the Commonwealth level. Some of the other taxes are fringe benefits tax, concessions on cars, luxury car tax, and some smaller things. One thing that is happening is that fuel excise is starting to diminish as a revenue source because cars become more and more efficient, and we're getting more and more electric vehicles. And so this is turning the attention of quite a lot of people to road user charging as an alternative. So although this fuel excise is not hypothecated to roads, it is quite a useful revenue base. Road user charging would be a more, or could be a much more accurate it could be a more efficient way of raising revenue than fuel excise, and probably that's one of the reasons why it's got quite a lot of supporters.
John?
Well, if you're going to increase taxes more generally, you're obviously looking to increase those taxes that will have the least impact on the economy and be least unfair. And the taxes that kind of pop up when you do that work, I guess, are looking at the superannuation tax concessions. They're obviously far too generous. A large part of them go to people who are never going to qualify for the age pension in the first place. And indeed, one of the promising things about this election is that, for all of the sound and noise and fury about superannuation taxes, actually the differences between the ALP and the LNP are pretty small. They both support winding back those concessions, not as much as we think they ought to be wound back, but it's a substantial step in the right direction. And then the other one is looking at the capital gains tax concession and negative gearing. Both of those distort economic behaviour, and particularly investment, away from a rational investment scheme. The evidence is that the total amount that's invested wouldn't change very much if you increase those taxes. Inherently, they're changing them would be less unfair than most of the other things you can look at. And if you look at, superannuation, negative gearing, capital gains tax, collectively those things could very substantially increase government revenue. We're talking collectively in the order of up to about $10 billion a year. That's not going to fix your $40 billion budget hole, but it's certainly going to be helpful.
I have no idea if our policy makers, if our future legislators are listening to this discussion this evening, but I know it's been terrifically illuminating, and so have your questions. Please thank our panellists, won't you?
Well, it only remains for me to thank a few people for making tonight possible. The Grattan administrative staff, who make it all seem very easy. The Grattan staff themselves. The Orange Book that we published tonight is a substantial piece of work that pulls together a lot of the work that we've done over the last 7 years. I don't think there is anyone who has worked at Grattan Institute whose work isn't in here one way or another, and I'd really like to thank them for all of the time and energy and enthusiasm that they've put into this work. And then to thank the State Library for this magnificent venue again. It's a great place to hold this kind of event, and we're really grateful for their support. And then finally to thank Virginia, who was, I hope, everything that I promised you in terms of a lively, interested, engaged person who kept us all on our toes. Thank you very much. And then finally, thank you all, to you as the audience, for coming. It's been great having you here, and we look forward to seeing you at the next Grattan Institute event. Thank you very much.